In the 1990s, wars ravaged several parts of the world and countless civilians suffered heinous atrocities. The UN failed to prevent these. As a result, the UN Security Council decided to include protection of civilians in its agenda. Peacekeeping is one of the tools the UN Security Council uses to maintain international peace and security, and since 1999, protection of civilians, POC, has been a priority objective of United Nations peacekeeping. Today, nearly all peacekeepers have a mandate to protect civilians. Governments are primarily responsible for protecting civilians on their territory, and peacekeepers support the state authorities to fulfill this obligation. However, where the state is unwilling or unable to do so, peacekeepers have an independent obligation to protect civilians from physical violence. Protection of civilians in UN peacekeeping is defined as without prejudice to the primary responsibility of the host state, integrated and coordinated activities by all civilian and uniform mission components to prevent, deter, or respond to threats of physical violence against civilians within the mission's capabilities and areas of deployment through the use of all necessary means, up to and including deadly force. POC mandates are grounded in international laws such as international human rights law, international humanitarian law, international refugee law, international criminal law, and regional legal regimes. It is important to understand that protecting civilians is not just the work of the military. Peacekeeping missions implement the POC mandate through a whole-of-mission, integrated, comprehensive approach that leverages the full capabilities of the mission. This involves the use of armed and unarmed approaches by all mission personnel, civilian, police, and military. As a whole-of-mission responsibility, POC demands coordinated effort at mission headquarters and at field office and sector level. The mission works closely with other protection actors, including UN agencies and NGOs. Who are the civilians whom missions are mandated to protect? For the purposes of the POC mandate in peacekeeping, everyone is to be considered a civilian except members of armed forces, members of organized armed groups who have continuous combat functions, and civilians directly participating in hostilities. In case of doubt whether a person is a civilian, they should be considered a civilian. What is a threat? When conflict reigns, civilians face a range of threats that put their lives, physical well-being, liberty, and property at risk. However, in UN peacekeeping, the protection of civilians is specifically concerned with protecting civilians from threats of physical violence. Such threats can include attacks on civilians, attempts to kill, torture, maim, rape, sexually exploit, forcibly displace, starve, pillage, abduct, detain, kidnap, traffic persons, or recruit and use children. It also includes harm associated with the presence of explosive ordnance such as mines, explosive remnants of war, and improvised explosive devices. Threat includes both violence against civilians that has materialized and is ongoing, as well as violence that has the realistic potential to occur. Given that women, men, boys, and girls often confront distinct types of threats in conflict, it is crucial not to regard civilians as a homogeneous group. Rather, various groups within the civilian population may need specific types of protection. The POC approach in UN peacekeeping consists of 3 tiers of action. Tier 1, protection through dialogue and engagement. Tier 2, provision of physical protection. Tier 3, establishment of a protective environment. These tiers can mutually reinforce one another and do not necessarily follow any order of sequence. They may all be pursued simultaneously or independently, depending on the specific context. Tier 1. Tier 1 relies on dialogue to protect. It involves using the mission's good officers to support inclusive, sustainable political solutions to conflict and talking with various actors, host governments, perpetrators of violence against civilians, and local communities. It also means providing support for conflict resolution, mediation, and reconciliation, and strengthening strategic communications, investigation, and reporting on human rights violations. Tier 2. Tier 2 is about protection through presence, which includes both uniformed and civilian components. This is achieved through patrolling as well as the display or use of force when necessary. UN military and police can detain perpetrators, secure critical locations, interposition themselves between armed actors and civilians at risk, or carry out proactive military and police operations. Peacekeepers can also facilitate evacuations, relocations, and transfers, as well as protect refugee and IDP camps. Under extreme circumstances, if civilians seek refuge at the UN premises, the UN is expected to protect them. Tier 3. Tier 3 entails leveraging technical expertise and building capacity of national actors to protect civilians. Activities are generally long-term and programmatic in nature. They aim to create a protective environment for civilians and to prevent the re-emergence of threats of physical violence. This includes supporting the re-establishment of the rule of law and strengthening the criminal justice system, facilitating security sector reform, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants, and community violence reduction programs. Tier 3 supports social cohesion and reconciliation activities while empowering civil society, journalists, human rights defenders, and communities to be effective agents of protection. These activities are often jointly undertaken by peacekeeping, humanitarian, and development partners. Do no harm. To prevent harm and risks to individuals and communities, all mission personnel must act with caution during their activities and interactions. Individuals must not be exposed to possible reprisals for cooperating with the UN, and any information that could identify sources or victims must be kept confidential and secured. Civilian harm mitigation. Missions must take steps to mitigate harm to civilians that could result from peacekeeping's own police and military operations. This includes measures to prevent, minimize, track, and address civilian harm before, during, and after such operations. UN peacekeeping is dedicated to protecting civilians using all the tools, capacities, and approaches described. However, peacekeeping operations have limited capacities and resources and cannot protect everyone, everywhere, at all times. While peacekeeping has proven to be an effective tool to prevent conflict, reduce violence, strengthen security, and thereby protect civilians, it is only a temporary measure. Ultimately, the most durable form of protection is sustainable and inclusive political solutions that put an end to violence.